When I moved into Willowbrook Estates 3 years ago, I thought I'd found the perfect suburban sanctuary. The houses were beautiful, the lawns meticulously maintained, and the HOA seemed well organized. What I didn't realize was that our HOA president, Karen Middleton, treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom and every resident like her subjects. Karen lived in the largest house on Maple Drive, a sprawling colonial that she'd painted an aggressive shade of beige that somehow managed to look both bland and attention-seeking. She'd been HOA president for 8 consecutive years, running unopposed because, frankly, nobody else wanted to deal with the endless complaints and petty disputes that seemed to follow her everywhere. My first real interaction with Karen came 6 months after I'd settled in. I'd installed a beautiful cedar privacy fence along the back of my property, connecting to the existing fence line that had been there for decades. The fence was well within my property boundaries, professionally installed, and matched the neighborhood aesthetic perfectly. That's when Karen appeared at my front door on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, and that particular smile that people use when they're about to ruin your day. "Good morning," she announced, not waiting for me to actually say good morning back. "I'm Karen Middleton, your HOA president, and we need to discuss your unauthorized fence installation." I explained that the fence was properly permitted through the city and fell within all HOA guidelines. I'd even checked the covenants twice before installation. But Karen shook her head with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything in her life. "The problem," she said, tapping her pen against her clipboard, "is that your fence is encroaching on my property line. I've lived here for 15 years, and I know exactly where my boundaries are. That fence needs to come down immediately." I suggested we review the property surveys to clarify the boundary lines, but Karen's expression hardened. "I don't need a survey to tell me what I already know. Your fence is on MY land, and according to HOA Bylaws Section 4.7, any structure that violates property boundaries constitutes a major violation subject to daily fines." Over the next 2 weeks, Karen escalated her campaign against my fence with military precision. First came the official violation notice, then daily photos documenting the encroachment, followed by increasingly aggressive letters threatening legal action. She started patrolling the fence line every morning with a measuring tape, making a grand show of documenting the supposed violation for anyone who happened to be watching. The breaking point came when I found Karen in my backyard at 7 a.m. on a Saturday, spray painting orange X marks along my fence posts while muttering about property rights and boundary violations. When I confronted her about trespassing, she simply smiled and informed me that as HOA president, she had the authority to inspect any potential violations on community property. That afternoon, I decided it was time to bring in the professionals. My college roommate had become a prominent land surveyor, and my neighbor 3 houses down worked for the county planning office. Within a week, I had arranged for a comprehensive boundary survey that would settle this dispute once and for all. But Karen wasn't content to wait for survey results. She ramped up her harassment campaign, sending daily violation notices, scheduling emergency HOA meetings to discuss my flagrant disregard for community standards, and even suggesting to other neighbors that my fence was somehow diminishing their property values. The survey team arrived on a Thursday morning with equipment that looked like it belonged on a NASA mission. Karen immediately appeared, hovering around the surveyors like a vulture, offering her own expert opinions about where the property lines should fall and pointing out various landmarks that she claimed proved her point. What the surveyors discovered that day was far more interesting than anyone had anticipated. Not only was my fence completely within my property boundaries with room to spare, but Karen's own property had some fascinating irregularities that apparently no one had noticed in 15 years. You see, when Karen bought her house, the previous owners had installed a decorative garden wall that extended about 4 feet beyond their actual property line, creating what appeared to be a larger backyard than they actually owned. Karen had been maintaining, landscaping, and treating this extra strip of land as her own for over a decade. Here's where it gets interesting. That strip of land that Karen had been claiming? It actually belonged to the county, designated as a utility easement that had never been properly marked or maintained. And my fence, which Karen insisted was on her property, it was actually a full 6 feet within my own boundaries. But the real revelation came when the surveyor pulled out the original neighborhood plat from 1987. Karen's house, which she'd always claimed was the largest lot in the development, was actually built on one of the smaller parcels. The previous owners had simply created the illusion of more space by incorporating county land into their landscaping. Armed with this information, I scheduled a private meeting with Karen to present the survey results. She arrived at my house with her usual clipboard and condescending attitude, clearly expecting me to announce that I'd be removing my fence immediately. Instead, I spread the official survey documents across my dining room table and watched as Karen's confident expression slowly transformed into confusion, then disbelief, then something approaching panic. According to the county surveyor, I explained calmly, my fence is not only completely within my property boundaries, but I actually have enough space to install a second fence if I wanted to. However, there seems to be an issue with your property that we should probably discuss. I pointed to the survey map showing her backyard. This area that you've been maintaining as part of your garden? It's actually county property. You've been trespassing on public land for 15 years. Karen's face went through several shades of red as she studied the documents. That's impossible, she stammered. I've lived here longer than anyone. I know where my property ends. But the evidence was undeniable. The survey included historical records, GPS coordinates, and measurements that had been verified by 3 different instruments. Karen had been unknowingly squatting on county land, while simultaneously accusing me of encroaching on property that wasn't even hers. Now, a reasonable person might have apologized for the misunderstanding and quietly resolved the situation. But Karen wasn't reasonable. Instead, she doubled down, claiming the survey was somehow flawed and demanding that I pay for a second survey to prove her point. That's when I realized Karen wasn't going to let this go gracefully. She'd made this dispute public, involved the entire HOA, and damaged my reputation in the neighborhood with her accusations. It was time for a more comprehensive solution. I made a phone call to my attorney, who specialized in municipal law and had excellent relationships throughout the county government. Within 48 hours, I learned some very interesting facts about utility easements, county property rights, and the legal obligations of people who improve public land without permission. Apparently, when someone makes unauthorized improvements to county property, they become liable for maintenance, taxes, and restoration costs. And if the county decides they want their land back, they can demand immediate removal of any unauthorized structures at the property owner's expense. My attorney also discovered that Karen's elaborate garden wall, decorative pond, and extensive landscaping on the county easement represented a significant investment, probably $30,000 worth of improvements that would need to be removed if the county ever decided to reclaim their property. But here's where my background in commercial real estate development became useful. I knew that counties often sell small parcels of unused land to adjacent property owners, especially when it simplifies boundary issues and generates revenue. And I also knew that the person who requests the sale typically gets first priority, assuming they meet the financial requirements. I submitted a formal proposal to purchase the utility easement from the county, along with a cashier's check for the full asking price and a letter from my attorney explaining the boundary dispute situation. The county was delighted to sell a small strip of unused land that had been nothing but a maintenance headache for decades. The sale process took about 6 weeks, during which Karen continued her campaign against my fence, apparently oblivious to the legal machinery that was slowly grinding into motion behind the scenes. She even organized a special HOA meeting to vote on my violation, inviting the entire neighborhood to witness her final triumph over my illegal encroachment. 3 days before Karen's big HOA meeting, I received the deed to my newly purchased county property. The strip of land that Karen had been treating as her extended backyard was now officially mine. Every flower she'd planted, every stone in her decorative wall, every gallon of water in her ornamental pond was now sitting on my property. But I wasn't quite finished. My attorney had prepared a comprehensive legal package that included not only the property transfer documents, but also a detailed accounting of all the unauthorized improvements Karen had made to what was now my land, along with a formal demand for immediate removal or compensation. The night before the HOA meeting, I hand-delivered a certified letter to Karen's door. Inside was a copy of the new deed, the survey results, and a legal notice informing her that she had 30 days to remove all unauthorized structures from my newly acquired property or face legal action for trespassing and property damage. Karen's emergency HOA meeting arrived, and she stood before 30 neighbors with her presentation about my fence violation, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. She'd prepared charts, photographs, and a detailed legal argument about why my fence needed to be removed immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen announced to the assembled crowd, we have a serious property violation that threatens the integrity of our entire community. This fence represents a flagrant disregard for our neighborhood standards and property rights. She clicked through her presentation with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. As you can see from these measurements, the fence clearly extends beyond the proper boundary line, and according to our HOA covenants, such violations must be corrected immediately. That's when I raised my hand and asked permission to address the group. Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she couldn't refuse without seeming unreasonable. I walked to the front of the room with my own folder of documents. I appreciate Karen's concern about property boundaries. I began, and I'm happy to report that we've resolved the boundary dispute definitively. Here are the official county survey results. I distributed copies of the survey to everyone in the room, watching as neighbors studied the detailed measurements and GPS coordinates. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people realized that my fence was not only legal, but positioned well within my property boundaries. But that's not the most interesting discovery, I continued. It turns out that Karen's garden area, the space she's been maintaining behind her house, is actually built on county property that she doesn't own. Karen's face drained of color as I explained the easement situation and the unauthorized improvements she'd made over 15 years. The room fell silent as neighbors absorbed the implications of what they were hearing. However, I said, pulling out the final document, I'm pleased to announce that I've resolved this situation by purchasing the easement from the county. As of 3 days ago, I am the legal owner of the property that Karen has been improving and maintaining. I handed Karen a copy of the deed, watching as her hands trembled slightly while she read the legal description of her new reality. The land where she'd built her decorative wall, planted her prized roses, and installed her expensive water features now belonged to me. According to my attorney, I continued calmly, Karen has 30 days to remove all unauthorized structures from my property, or I'll be forced to charge her for the improvements as compensation for 15 years of unauthorized use. The room was dead silent as Karen stared at the deed, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and dawning comprehension. She looked up at me, then at the surveyor documents, then back at the deed, as if hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into a different reality. This is impossible, she whispered, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. I've been maintaining that land for 15 years. It's part of my property, not according to the county records. I replied, maintaining the same calm tone I'd used throughout our entire dispute. And not according to the survey you demanded. The boundary is exactly where my fence indicates it should be. Karen's eyes widened as the full scope of the situation finally hit her. She wasn't just wrong about my fence. She'd been wrong about her own property for 15 years. And now, thanks to her own insistence on resolving the boundary dispute, she'd lost the extra land she'd been treating as her own, while I'd gained not only vindication, but actual ownership of the space she'd invested thousands of dollars improving. The woman who'd spent weeks lecturing me about property rights and HOA regulations was now standing in front of her neighbors, holding a deed that proved she'd been the one violating property boundaries all along. Her face went completely white as she realized that her campaign against my fence had led directly to the loss of what she'd considered her own backyard. Karen tried to speak, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water, but no words came out. Around the room, neighbors who had listened to weeks of her complaints about my illegal fence were now staring at her with a mixture of shock and barely concealed amusement. So, I said, gathering my documents with the same calm efficiency Karen had always used during her harassment campaign, I'll expect you to begin removing your unauthorized structures from my property within 30 days, as outlined in the legal notice. And of course, my fence will be staying exactly where it is. Karen finally found her voice, but it came out as nothing more than a strangled whisper. But that's my garden. She looked around the room desperately, seeking support from neighbors who were now seeing her in an entirely new light. The HOA president, who had built her reputation on enforcing rules and boundaries, had just discovered she'd been breaking them for 15 years. And her victim had turned the tables so completely that she was now the one facing violation notices and legal demands. As I walked toward the door, Karen was still standing there clutching the deed, finally understanding that sometimes when you declare war over a fence, you might just lose your entire backyard.